If you are struggling to deal with dive heroes when you're playing ranked within Marvel Rivals, then this video is going to give you 5 tips on how to counter them. Now the first tip is awareness. Now this kind of goes without saying and probably seems pretty obvious, but you'll be surprised that people just tunnel vision on what their task is during a match. And of course you should focus on what your goal is, whether it's doing frontline tanking, whether it's doing range DPSing or supporting your team. Whatever your task is, then yes, you should focus on that. However, you'll be surprised that a lot of people don't know what's going on around them by simple cues. Now, first of all, if the enemy team does have a dive hero in their team, the likelihood is they're going to be diving your backline anyway, and they're going to be diving onto your support. So that's something you need to keep in your mind every single game you play, because that is what they've been told to do by all the YouTube guides and all the tutorials that they've watched online, is dive the healers and take out the healers. So just if you know that, it's something you're going to watch out for in your future games. Now, not only that, small cues will give you an indication of what's going on. For example, if you're a Magneto or a frontline tank like Doctor Strange as well, and you're getting healed up, you're dealing damage, you're doing your thing, and all of a sudden you're no longer getting heals anymore, then the likelihood is your support players are getting dived on. That is why they're no longer healing you, especially if you're a frontline tank. But if you're like a big beefy Groot or something like that, then trust me, your supports do want to heal you up. They're just not able to do it at that current moment in time. This brings me swiftly on to my next point, and that is peeling, or as I like to call it, just turn around, man. And the reason why this is important is because if you've noticed that you're no longer getting heals and your support's getting dived on, whilst, let's say for example you're Magneto and you have a Doctor Strange, whilst one of your shield tanks are holding that front line, then what you can do is turn around and support your hero or teammate that's getting dived on. Now this can be a DPS hero, it could be a support, and it doesn't really matter who's getting dived, just someone else needs to turn around and help them and support them in winning that fight however which way they can. Let's say it's the range DPS hero that's getting dived on, then the support healer that is usually healing up the tank in the front line should then start healing that hero that is getting dived on, allowing them a better chance of winning that fight. This will help you a ton in staying alive a lot longer when playing Marvel Rivals, and also dealing with dive attacks in the first place. You do need the support of your team, and like I said, it is a team-based shooter. And even just small things, for example, like a Magneto bubble. So instead of him bubbling himself, he can bubble his support, and that way you can stay alive just a little bit longer to help you win that team fight. So like I said, make sure you're using the live pings so that people can see that there's enemies behind them in your team. The next tip is hero selection. Now, there's heroes that are in this game that are designed to deal with the dive heroes in the first place. So they're actually putting the game on purpose to counter those characters. So you do want to make use of this. If you find yourself getting attacked by Venoms, Spider-Mans, Iron Fists, Wolverines, whatever it may be that you're struggling against when it comes to dive heroes in this game, there are strong counters to these, and we've got a list of the heroes that I find strong and decent at dealing with divers, and you'll see them on screen just now. Now, as you can see, we've got heroes like Jeff and Rocket, who are support heroes. Now, their hitbox is really small, so that's the one thing that makes them harder to kill. Also, the movement's really good, so Jeff can essentially go underground. Rocket's got his jetpack, so it allows him to get away a little bit quicker, and they both also have self-sustain, so they can heal themselves as well. That is one way of dealing with dive if you want to play a support. Invisible Woman does it slightly differently. She has CC control, so a lot of her abilities either push enemies away or suck enemies towards her orb. Again, when it comes to dive heroes, they're pretty low HP and they do get pushed or pulled pretty easily. Scarlet Witch and Cloak deal with it again slightly differently. They have insta-lock attacks, so basically their attacks are auto aim, so that means you're always going to be dealing damage to these low HP dive heroes, and you don't need to aim whatsoever, because that is the struggle with killing the dive heroes, is that their movement is insanely fast and you cannot track it. If you've ever seen one of the high level Black Panther players, you're not even seeing where this guy's going completely, so you just want basically spin your screen in circles and just aim and see what happens. And with Cloak and Dagger and Scarlet Witch, you can actually kill the guy. Then when it comes to Namor, Magneto and Penny Parker, they kind of deal with it again slightly differently. So Namor and Penny Parker have their traps or Namor's turrets, which again are auto aim, and the traps for Penny Parker essentially kill players by just them walking over the mines. So that's a good way. And Magneto just has tons of self-sustain, so there's kind of almost no point to try and kill a Magneto because he's got shield, he's got bubbles, he's got loads of HP. So there's so much Magneto has when it comes to just staying alive that it's kind of pointless killing him. Then we've got decent heroes which are like Doctor Strange, similar to Magneto but not quite as strong, and also his Maelstrom of Madness attack does actually output a solid amount of damage to kill these kind of dive characters that are coming closer to you, and it's also a radius effect attack, so you don't need to aim it. Mr. Fantastic has his kind of penguin ability where he just absorbs damage, so you can just hit that anytime that you just want to stay alive essentially. Luna Snow has the frost bubble, which basically freezes enemies. Now this can work, but again you need to aim that correctly, and that's why I've put her in the decent section. Loki can use his runes to either just stay alive from the whole duration of the attack, or he can also switch to one of his doppelgangers. That's another way to counter it as well. Now, it's not going to kill the dive hero in any way, but it does allow him to stay alive a lot longer, which is still a kind of counter as well. Squirrel Girl basically does a lot of splash damage, so if you're seeing one of your teammates getting dived, then Squirrel Girl is actually a really solid player to use. But when it comes to yourself getting dived, unless you're kind of blasting the acorns off the ground or you're able to use her stun ability, then that is something you need to try and practice, but it's a little bit more difficult to use than some of the stronger heroes like I mentioned before. The next tip is kind of easier said than done, if I'm being perfectly honest, and the reason why is because a lot of people do play solo queue when it comes to ranked in this game, and I think that's kind of where the issue comes in when it comes to coordinating with your team. But you want to play close to your team as much as possible, and everyone in the team needs to kind of do this together. And the reason why is because if you have a dive composition on the opposite team, whether it be two heroes or even just one, for example, let's say they have two, they've got a Venom and a Spider-Man, and they're going to dive into your team, there's no way they come out of that alive if there is 6v2, basically them diving straight in the middle of your team where you're huddled very closely together, getting heals, tanking, and also dealing DPS damage. There's no way they come out of that alive. They might get a pick, don't get me wrong, but they're not going to stay in that fight very long. So like I said, you want to stay very close to your team as much as you can. So the last and final tip is my favorite one, and that is to counter dive. And what that means is if the enemy team has one dive hero and then they're diving your backline, that means the enemy team's essentially down one player whilst that player is basically off doing his own thing, trying to dive you. Now obviously he's still there somewhere, and good dive players know how to kind of play, dive, support their team as well at the same time, so it just depends on the level you're playing at. But again, you can actually counter dive this, so essentially the enemy team is down a player. If you pick a dive hero and do the same to the enemy team, your team is down a player, and everyone that you're playing with is probably in the same rank anyway, so they should know what their role is in playing. So a 5v5 is pretty fair if two players on each team are diving essentially. Now, like I said, that makes it a fair fight, and obviously you need to be a kind of decent-ish dive hero. You don't actually need to be that good at dive to be doing well in this game, because of the way the dive heroes are actually set up and the fact that dive is super powerful and broken right now, and that's also the reason I'm making this video in the first place. So I want to share a few heroes with you that have good diving capabilities, and they involve little upfront investment in terms of learning the character to then actually performing relatively well as a dive character. Now, we want to stay away from Black Panther and we want to stay away from Spider-Man, because those two heroes in particular, they are the best dive heroes in the game if I'm being perfectly honest. But again, they involve a lot of skill, a lot of combo learning, and a lot of time played on these characters. So we're not talking about them too, but when you do come up against them, they are pretty solid if the player knows what they're doing. But when we're talking about the kind of mid-level ones, you've got the Hulk. He's a really good dive hero, and you've also got Venom as well, who's really strong right now. But those are the ones that I'm not mentioning. Again, we want some really low upfront investment here. The first is Iron Fist. Now, Iron Fist is the easiest to use and one of the most effective dive heroes in this game. Not only that, he's a tank buster as well, so he serves a few different roles. And we've got a full guide on how to use Iron Fist on the channel, especially after the update, because he had a lot of damage changes. But again, he's a really solid choice when it comes to dealing with enemy players and playing as a dive character. And the other one I think is very low investment, and because a lot of people like to use him anyway, and that is Star-Lord. Now, Star-Lord is not a dive hero in this game. He just has some dive-like capabilities, and what that means is if you're already a really good Star-Lord player anyway, you're probably doing half of the stuff regardless, but you can use Star-Lord as a kind of dive character because he has good movement, he deals good damage up close, he basically has all the abilities, and he's able to escape from fights relatively easily. So he has kind of all the kit to be a dive hero, but he's not quite as strong as some of the other options like I mentioned. But like I said, those two are the easiest two to use in this entire game right now. So if you do want to basically counter dive the enemy team, then those are the ones I would pick if you're struggling to find a solid option. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something new, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and thank you very much for watching.